simplistic idea I want to share with you. From simple minds come simple ideas. That's going to be told overly complicated just for the sake of fun. We'll be looking here in Philippians chapter 1. I want to do slightly a lengthy reading. Set the stage, though. Paul is in prison. He writes here as a bondservant. Usually his kind of standard reading in chapter, or in most introductions of books, in which he writes from prison. Remember that Paul has gone to Jerusalem. He has been beaten and put into prison. There was a coup to try to get him killed in prison while being transported back in Ford, which then led him to be sent to Caesarea, where he cooled his heels for at least 2 years. From there, he got sent to Rome with a detour on the island of Malta, not the most pleasant of vacations, and then over to Rome, where he got to then live at his own expense, still waiting to find out whether he's going to be executed. So, to recap, he has been beaten and imprisoned in 2 different prisons for 2 years, followed by being shipwrecked and left on an island in the middle of winter, and then sent to a 3rd prison all in this time span. Now, Paul writes the Philippians, and he says in verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so it has become known through the whole imperial guard and to the rest of that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Christ Jesus, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For if I am to live in the flesh, that means faithful or fruitful labor for me, yet which I choose I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between 2. My desire is to depart and to be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all, for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus, because my coming to you again. But only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so whether I come to see you or am absent, I may hear of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. For this is a clear sign for them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. I'm going to put a pin there in Philippians chapter 1. We'll come back to there in just a moment. I want to set that in the back of our minds so that we can discuss kind of something. I want to attempt to write on the board. We might abbreviate a lot of words again, because that's how things go. So you have a typical situation where you make choices. And then in that you have consequences. And then from there, it's either a good consequence or a poor consequence or a bad one. And this is typically when we do. Now, making a choice is never quite as simple as that. We always have a hierarchy of things that we look at to figure out. But typically, this is what we try to teach our kids through the process of growing up of how to make choices. When you make a choice, it's not just based on what you want at that moment. You should also really consider the consequences. Now, There's an old saying, and I'll say it because John's not here, from West Virginia at least. There are some who learn by reading, and some by observation, and everyone else has to touch the electric fence themselves. We hope that we can look at other people's consequences and say, oh, they have some bad consequences. I don't want to do what they did. Or they had some really good consequences. I probably want to imitate them in the things that they chose. We do this in some positive ways, and we do this in some negative ways. When it comes to this process, we think, there's a person who has done well in business. I want to do what they did. If that means working long hours, if that means saving money and then investing money back again, that means holding off on a bigger paycheck to reinvest the money back into the business, there's a whole bunch of things that goes into that. We think, they have some good consequences. I want to do what they did. We do it in the negative way too. Ooh, that person's got lung cancer. Probably don't want to smoke. Probably a pretty poor consequence. Easy to remove that problem out of my life by just not smoking. And so we do this all the time. But when it comes to spiritual matters, this isn't the model to use. And I want to explain that using Philippians chapter 1. There's a different model that Paul describes. We have choices that we make all the time for spiritual matters. And we have consequences. Spelling doesn't count today. It's a freebie. But this... But the consequences for spiritual matters are not just spiritual. They are physical and social. There are other consequences to consider in all of that. When you make a choice, spiritually speaking, you're going to have consequences that are going to be spiritual, whether or not it affects your relationship with God, whether it affects your soul or not, and you're probably going to have some physical consequences as well. Is this something that is going to ruin my reputation for other people? Negative consequences. Is this something that is going to lead me to lose some friends in the process? Am I going to be derided in my workplace? Are people going to mock me for my choices? Am I going to be the oddball in my neighborhood for being the weird family who does that thing all the time? You have some of those. And the same thing, you have some good consequences and you have some poor consequences for both of these. The problem comes in is that oftentimes we use this model and only this model when it comes to spiritual choices. And we forget about this quite a bit. I want us to consider what's happening here in Philippians. Paul is writing to a congregation who he tells them to imitate him. Very clearly and in those exact words in chapter 3. What you see, imitate. He uses that point there towards the end of chapter 3. Paul's going to write to the Philippians, and he tells them, I am in prison, and I've been in prison for a couple years. And then I was beaten, and then I was shipwrecked, and put back in prison after all of that. And when we look at this, we think, ooh, those consequences, they're pretty poor. I don't know if I want to join in on that. That's not something that I really want to be a part of. But yet here, consider what he says in verse 14. He says that, well, first off in verse 12, this is served to the advance of the gospel, and that has become known through all of the imperial guard, and the rest, and to all the rest, that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment. Which means that when they looked at the consequences in Paul's life, they didn't say, ooh, that's a poor consequence, I don't want to do that. For some reason, they thought, there's some good consequences there. I want to be emboldened in this. Which leads to a whole different model of decision making. Which just comes out here. They looked at Paul's spiritual consequences. Where was Paul at between him and his God? Now physically, he had some pretty bad social consequences. No longer welcomed at home in Jerusalem amongst his fellow peers. Physically, he was in pretty poor shape. Most likely going blind by this point in time. Imagine what it would be like for your body to be stoned and shipwrecked and beaten, and then all of that, and then to live in a prison environment. It probably wouldn't be comfortable. Just my guess. There's a reason that Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 4 to Timothy, he says, please bring my cloak. It's getting cold. I'm uncomfortable. Now, that's a sidestep. So time back in. He's suffered a lot physically, but spiritually, he was exactly where he needed to be. And that's where you have here in verse 14, the brethren said, I'm emboldened by that. He has a good relationship with God, and despite his physical, social consequences for his action, I want to join in doing that. I want to keep spreading the gospel. And so Paul kind of continues on. We're going to skip on down into verse 19. The end of the sentence is actually the end of verse 18. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and your help of the Spirit of Christ Jesus, this will turn out for my deliverance. Now, the deliverance that he mentions in verse 19 is not, I'm going to be let out of prison. Because he makes the point very clearly in verse 20 that whether by life or by death, that's still up in the air. One of the phrasings that he uses in chapter 2 is that if he's being poured out in verse 17 as a drink offering for them, it's a way of saying if I'm beheaded for you, that's okay. So back in chapter 1, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know if he's going to be beheaded, if he's going to be killed for this. So the deliverance he speaks in verse 19 is he's going to be delivered and transitioned into the kingdom, whether by life or by death. He's saved. And that's going to be good. That's going to be enough for him. And so he says in verse 20, as is my eager expectation and hope, that I will not at all be ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's a simple phrase, but it speaks so profoundly. That as Christians, when we make our choices, and we have to weigh these two things, that I can have a really good physical, social consequence for my actions. I can get out of conflict, and I can have people like me, and I can have a good relationship with my friends that I want to have a relationship with, because I don't have to say anything. What happens to my spiritual consequence? What if getting in good physical and social consequences, what if that hinders my relationship with God? What if that makes me have a poor spiritual life? Is that worth it? And Paul's unanimous, outstanding response in Philippians chapter 1 is that when he has to choose between these two, he is always going to choose this one. Every time. Now, we're going to go back to this model for a second. How many times do we see people who suffer for the things that they're going through and think, ooh, I just don't want to be like them, and fail to experience or fail to consider where they are spiritually? Paul says if he lives, it's great. He's going to continue working for God. He's going to continue to edify the churches. He's going to continue to do all that he needs to do. But if he dies, it's even better. Kind of a weird way of looking at it, but that's what he says. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I get to live, in verse 22, fruitful labor. But which I will choose, I cannot tell. In verse 23, I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart to be with Christ, for that is not just better, but that's far better. If I have all the bad physical consequences, beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, imprisoned again, if I have all of those, but my spiritual life is good, that's still good. That is still acceptable. Now Paul says, he's going to be even more selfless here in verse 24 and verse 25. To remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. His point is that it's better for me just to go and be with God. It's going to be amazing. I'm longing for that at this point. But it's necessary for you, for me to stick around and encourage you more. And so convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you for your progress and joy in the faith. Well, how did he get in this situation in the first place? How did he get in prison in the first place? Well, because he was associating with Gentiles, like the Philippians. And he got beaten because they thought that he brought Gentiles into the temple, which he didn't. But it was his work for them that got him beaten and imprisoned in the first place. And he says, I will continue to do that if I get to live. Paul says, again, whatever physical and social conflict that I have, whatever consequences that arise from that, it's okay because of your spiritual consequences through that. That his work is not solely just, I'm going to preach, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to make my money, and I'm going to preach, and I'm going to move on, is that he works for their benefit. When it comes to our choices, what we do here at this congregation at Colonial, our choices are going to have a physical and a social ramification. If we speak as boldly as we ought to here in Williamsburg, if we proclaim the gospel as soundly as we ought to, there are going to be people who hate us. There are going to be conflicts that may, imagine the scenario where they were in Philippians, where Paul got beaten while there, and they have to decide to show up the next Sunday. What if they beat the leaders here, or the men here, or the women here? Would we show up the next week hoping to worship some more? And yet that's the situation that the Philippians were in. So he tells them that his work with them, his worship with them, is for their benefit. Not just for him to feel good and to make it to church and to fulfill his requirements. But convinced of this, he says in verse 25, I will remain and continue with you for your progress and joy in the faith. That his work with them for their progress and their joy in the faith was worth the physical consequences that he had to go through. And then he advocates for them in verse 27, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come or whether I'm absent, and they hear of you, and that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened by anything by your opponents. He says, I can't be with you. That's the whole point. Paul's in prison, in Rome. He can't go and be with you. There's no leave. He doesn't get a note and say, okay, you've got 3 months to make it over to Philippi and come back. It's not going to happen. Whether I get to be with you or not, ever again, I want to hear that you are standing firm in the gospel, that your manner of life is worthy of the gospel. You're standing side by side, fighting for that. So, whenever we look at the consequences, I don't know, Paul. Don't know if I want to live the way that you live, because that's not the kind of life that I want. Thinking only of physical consequences, they're going to make the wrong choices. Who would say, yeah, the person that I know that was beaten for the gospel, I want to continue to live like them, if they're only thinking of physical consequences? It's not going to happen. So he tells them, though, you need to think primarily of spiritual consequences. Let that be the priority in your life. It's a very simple concept, but it is rather profound to change that paradigm of how we make choices. I want to look at just a couple other passages, and that's it. Like I said, simple minds, simple ideas, and then we'll let the lesson be yours. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. We'll probably do a little more work in Hebrews chapter 11 another day. I was sitting with Brittany. We've had a lot of quiet time in the house. It's been amazing. I'm getting tired of it, but it's amazing for the short time that we can have a quiet time in the house. And something finally clicked for Hebrews chapter 11. I don't know what has taken me so long, and I'll share that with you at another time. But all that's to say, I'm excited about it. Verses 32 down to verse 38. Faith in Hebrews chapter 11 is defined by the actions that people take based on their faith. It is an active living faith here in Hebrews chapter 11. And starting in verse 32, the Hebrew writer just says, I don't have time to tell you of all the amazing things that happened through faith. And so he just says, time would fail me to tell you of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. And all of those people, just by listing their names, you think of all the amazing things that faithful action can bring about in life. And then he gives consequences untied to names for the next couple verses. He says, who through faith they conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped from the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, and became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And so down to verse 35, sometimes faithful action has amazing physical consequences. How amazing would that be to have your dead returned back to you? Think about some of the people maybe that you have lost. The people that every day kind of pop in your mind. I kind of wish they had been here with me today. And I'm sure all of us are thinking of somebody right now. Women receive back their dead by resurrection. That's an amazing physical consequence by being faithful. He mentions the idea of being made strong out of weakness, putting whole armies to flight. They enforced justice. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouths of lions. That'd be cool. I mean, when it comes to like cooler talk on Monday, like having that story to tell, it kind of trumps all other stories. When it comes to what did you do this weekend? Well, I stopped the mouths of lions. That would be kind of a neat thing to happen. And so sometimes the physical consequences of being faithful are remarkable. But midway through verse 35, he mentions that sometimes faithful actions have negative consequences. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might raise again to a better life. Others suffered mockings and floggings, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned and sawn in two. They were killed with the sword, and they went about in sheep's skins and goat skins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Sometimes faithful actions have hard results. And when we see others going through that, sometimes we shrink back from that. Two verses. One is going to be here, the next verse in verse 39. All of these commended through their faith. That right there should give you an indication of what God thought about them. They were commended to God or by God through their faith. But back in chapter 10, the reason that chapter 11 is here is because of the previous couple verses in chapter 10, starting in verse 32. So the Hebrew writer is writing to an audience that is beginning to shrink back. They're beginning to lose their faith. They're no longer holding on to their original confidence or confession. And so he reminds them that their only hope, their only joy, their only comfort comes through Christ. And so starting here in chapter 10 and verse 32 is kind of the conclusion to some of these things. Recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, but you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while my coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, I will have no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and preserve their souls. The point that he makes here in both of these verses, and the end of chapter 10, the very end of chapter 11, is that sometimes faith has amazing consequences, and sometimes it has very hard consequences, physically speaking. But regardless of that, we need to have faith and persevere. We need to consider our spiritual consequences more important than our physical consequences. Yes, sometimes you look at people and think, they have done amazing things through faith. I want to be like that. And sometimes we see people who have suffered amazing things and think, I don't want to be like that. But that shouldn't be our main guiding force when it comes to making decisions. Paul also writes to the Corinthians. This will be our last two verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 2 Corinthians chapter 5 back to back. As we get into the last couple of verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the whole chapter 15 is dealing with death and the resurrection. Whatever the Corinthians are suffering, whatever this present distress is they're under, Paul waits to the very end of his letter to talk about the really hard subject of death. And he tells them in verse 58, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, and always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Whatever physical consequences the Corinthians are going to have to go through, if they remain steadfast and immovable, if they always abound in the work of the Lord, their labor isn't in vain. That physical consequence doesn't matter as much, because this is but momentary, and forever is forever. So I want one more passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. There's a common theme through Hebrews chapter 11, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and 2 Corinthians chapter 5. They all deal with suffering. They all deal with the subject of possible death. And Philippians chapter 1 as well. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we'll look at verses 6 down through verse 10. He says, we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, and we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or we are away, we make it our aim to please Him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due to him, what is done in the body, whether good or evil. Now, we're dealing with extremes, whether it be in Philippians with Paul's beatings and imprisonments and shipwrecks and possible execution. When we're dealing with the persecution that the Corinthians are under, or the persecution that the Hebrews are under. Whatever the case may be, he deals with this in the extreme case, in the extreme of whether you live or die. And if it's true in the extreme case, then it should be true in the minor case. Whenever we consider the choices that we're going to make, and we think of the ramifications of the physical and the social implications, and we let that be our deciding factor, we made the wrong choice. If we make our choices based on the spiritual, then we will have made the right choice. It doesn't mean that we are longing for and looking for physical bad consequences. That isn't at all the point. The point is what do you let be your guiding factor in the choices that you make? Do you consider the spiritual at all? And do you let that be the most predominant thing that you're going to use to make choices? This model is a great model. This model is a wonderful model to teach our children, to really consider the consequences of other people's actions so that we can decide whether or not to imitate them or not. But when it comes to spiritual matters, we have to use a different model. Because we can't just think of the physical consequences, because we are both flesh and spirit. And one's going to last a whole lot longer than the other. One we're going to have to live with a lot longer than the other. Thank goodness, because mine is just a wreck. Eyes and ears and all kinds of problems, knees and back. I'm glad that I get to shirk this someday. I want to make sure that my spiritual home is waiting for me. Because I know what's going to happen later on to this home. Whatever problems I have now, they're going to get a lot worse. And that isn't the main thing I want to preserve. I'm looking for the same thing that Abraham's looking for. A city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. When we consider what Paul writes, we're going to kind of end there, the same place we began, which is Philippians chapter 1. Paul is suffering terribly. And he writes to an audience who he's still going to encourage for them to imitate him, to follow in his footsteps, not hoping that they follow in prison or in beatings or in shipwrecks, his spiritual life. And so he tells them to only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. And then in verse 28, not frightened by anything by your opponents. Makes pretty clear. Make sure you live worthy of the gospel, that you stand side by side, and that you're not frightened by anything by the opponents. Choose spiritual. Consider that foremost of importance. Make the right choices, and everything else will follow from there. So the challenge we have this week is to really consider how we make our choices. What is it that you use to decide what you're going to do? And do you really consider the spiritual implications as first importance? It doesn't mean that we don't consider physical consequences by any means. It's just that when it comes to making the choices, one of them has to take priority over the other. Take some time to ask yourself, what is it that you really make those choices with? The song that's been picked out for us was number 818. Since we're talking about consequences and choices, this is a perfect time to talk about consequences and choices. We have an opportunity right now, as long as we still have breath, to, as Matt had mentioned in his prayer earlier, to really give our lives over to God. If we choose to not do that, I can guarantee us what that spiritual consequence is going to be. But if we choose to give our lives over to God, then our security is amazing. Our hope is amazing. And if we can help you to do that this morning, make that calling and election sure, let us know as we stand and sing number 818.